G'day you mob, how's it going? Welcome to this episode of Pete's 2 Cents. This is an episode where I answer your questions, and as a reminder, there's no transcript for these lessons because that allows me to just record them and upload them really quickly. And it's also an excuse for you guys to just work on your listening comprehension without being able to read at the same time if you're a member of the Premium Podcast. And remember, if you do want to sign up for the Premium Podcast, you can do so at aussieenglish.com.au/podcast, and you will get access to bonus episodes, the online transcript reader, so that you can play these episodes and read the text at the same time. And you will also get access to transcripts for every single episode except for the Pete's 2 Cents series. So yes. So welcome guys, I hope you're having a good week. It's been a pretty eventful one here. My wife for the last, a few years has been on her L plates, right? Her learner's plates whilst driving. So she's been learning to drive. And last week, I think it was on Friday, she actually passed her license. So she had to do an online test, and then she had to do an examination. You know, it's like a 20-minute drive with someone in there who's marking, the different things that you have to do. And she passed, so congrats to Kel. But it's funny, I wanted to talk about it. I might get Kel on the podcast to talk about the process of getting her learner's permit and then getting her probationary permit or license. But in Australia, we have what are called P plates for probation, which means you're effectively allowed to drive on your own, but there's restrictions, and I think you have to have them for 2 or 3 years, depending on the situation and where you are in Australia. I think it's 3 years for most people. I'm not sure what the deal is for my wife because she's got green P plates, I think because of her age, whereas if you're a young kid going for your Ps in Victoria, for your license, you'll get red Ps for the first year and then you get green Ps after that. But if you're above a certain age, it's just green Ps. So I think that's the situation, but I'm not 100% sure. I have to ask her if she's on them for 3 years or for just 2 years. So yeah, that was really cool, really proud of her. She worked really hard. She was getting lessons and then, went for the license and passed. And today is the first day that she's actually driving into work by herself. So as we speak, she's driving in. So hopefully that goes well. But yeah, good job, Kelly. And I guess I wanted to mention, it's kind of a cultural difference between Brazil and Australia, at least the way that she tells me. It's dependent on where you're from in Brazil and which class and all that sort of stuff, socioeconomically. But Kel was saying that, like her mother's family, her mum and dad have divorced. They divorced a long time ago, but her mother's family, no one drives, right? They have an apartment or a house that they live in, and everyone just sort of walks to and from wherever they need to go, or they use public transport because they live close to the city. Whereas her dad's family, I think, at least her dad, probably all the males in the family, the older males will drive. But she was saying that, it's pretty uncommon for young people to go for their license and have the money to do that in Brazil, unless you're rich. And so, it was one of these things where I was like, what do you mean? It's so weird for me that you're not able to drive from the age of 18. Most people, probably, above 90% of Australian kids who are finishing high school in year 12 will get their license, right? They'll get their learner's permit, their L plates, when they're 16. You can do it from 16 in Victoria. And then they practice for 2 years, and then at 18 they can go for their license. A lot of people do it on their birthday because they're just that, motivated to want to drive by themselves. And so, it was sort of a weird thing when Kel was telling me, no, it's not, most people that she knows in Brazil at least, you kind of choose, once you get a job, if you can use public transport, you just do that, and you pick between buying a car and driving around and buying, say, an apartment or a house. And so she, bought an apartment instead. And so, that was one of those things where I was just like, what? It's weird because, in Brazil, it seems she was saying, younger people can kind of afford to buy property at the expense of being able to drive. But in Australia, I think the average person wouldn't be able to buy property until now. They're probably in their mid-30s like me. Kel and I bought our house only 2 years ago. And it was, that's pretty normal now. It's pretty uncommon to ever hear of someone in their 20s owning their own house. That was a big cultural shock. I think too, cars in Australia, secondhand cars are quite cheap. So you can find cars for only a few $1,000s that you can drive around, right? That you can buy. Whereas from what I understand, again, I've never been to Brazil, but my wife was saying that cars in Brazil, second-hand or brand new, are very expensive. And so you need a lot of money to have a car and to run a car. And the last cultural difference was she was saying that when you learn to drive in Brazil, you need to pay for lessons. And you can only drive in a car when you have an instructor with you. You can't, like here in Australia, when you get your L plates, you can drive with anyone who's got a full license. So your parents, friends, family, strangers, theoretically. But anyone who's got a license, you can be in the car with that person as long as they're in the front passenger seat, and you can drive around and get practice. Whereas in Brazil, Kel was saying that you need to hire an instructor every single time you want to get behind the wheel and practice driving, which again just adds to the expense of getting a license and having a car, because that would be thousands upon thousands of dollars. So that's the situation. I wanted to talk to you about TV shows. So I've been watching some TV shows recently. Surprise, surprise. And there's been some really good ones. I've started Three Body Problem, which seems really interesting. Three Body Problem. I've only sort of gone 1 or 2 episodes in though, because I kind of got distracted with another series called Shogun. So this is one about like feudal Japan. I think it's late 1500s, early 1600s. It's around that period. And the premise is like there's a lot of infighting amongst the upper echelons of Japanese society. So the people right at the top. I believe that there is an emperor's son, or at least the leader of the country, he's been killed and his son is too young to rule. So they end up forming like a council of 5 different, I guess they're kind of like lords, to run the country until he comes of age. But there's obviously a lot of infighting, and one of the lords is sort of trying to take control. And it's just so interesting. I find that era of Japanese culture with samurais and the class system, the emperors, the lords, all this sort of stuff, just endlessly fascinating. So it's been a really interesting show to watch. And it's good because it has a guy from England who ends up in Japan as one of the protagonists of the show, right? So you can follow him around. He's speaking a lot of English. But you kind of get to see everything through the eyes of an outsider, so that a lot of what's going on culturally and everything gets explained, right? So, because I'm not Japanese, obviously, I have very limited exposure to this stuff and don't understand a lot of what's going on. But because the story includes these 2 separate cultures, you kind of get it all explained to you a little more in depth so that you can understand what's going on. And it's kind of 50% in Japanese and 50% in English, which is, really cool too, because you get to, I don't know. I think it caters to both audiences, so that Japanese people in Japan will probably watch this show as a result of much of it being in Japanese. And a lot of English speakers around the world are obviously going to watch the show as well, because a lot of it's in English. So it's been really, really fascinating to watch. And I think the second last episode came out yesterday, and I just watched that. And it's definitely got me sitting on the edge of my chair waiting for the finale. And it's so good that I'm sort of hoping that there's a follow-up series to it, But it's one of those things where at the same time I'm torn between having them carry on the series and have to kind of just make up what's going to happen next, as opposed to following the writing that was in the book that was written in the, I think, 70s or 80s, that's called Shogun. So, because it tends to go downhill. That's what happened with Game of Thrones, right? Everything kind of went to shit after the books had ended, and the people writing the show had to kind of wing it, and it just went to garbage. Anyway, so long intro. I hope you enjoyed it though, and you'll have to let me know if you're watching any really cool TV shows. I guess I should mention, I've just heard about a good Australian TV show that's just come out called High Country. High Country. And High Country is the area in Victoria that's up in the mountains, right? It's high up in the mountains, High Country. And it's apparently a mystery. So it's like a murder mystery. I don't know. It's got a lot of Australian police in it, so I assume it's related to crime and mystery and everything like that. But it looks really cool because it's set in, I guess it would be northeastern Victoria, and yeah, it's just a cool Australian show. Seems to have a lot of famous characters or famous actors, sorry, in there playing different characters. So that might be one worth sussing out. I think from what I remember, it's on the platform Binge if you want to check it out. Though, if you're like me, you probably know of other ways of getting it online. So we'll leave that at that. Okay, let's get into some of the questions here. Okay, this one comes from 2 Red. Okay, he says, I assume it's a he. I can't really say. I think it's a he. Does every Aussie say "G'day, mate" every time you meet others? No, I wouldn't say that most would say that. It is obviously really common here, and you would probably hear it on a daily basis if you were interacting with a lot of Australians. It's typically going to be used more by men than women, and this is one of those interesting things with language where there's a bit of a difference between the genders, right? Because it's a little more masculine to say something like "G'day, mate," whereas women will do it, but it tends to be a sort of masculine way of speaking. And so if you've got women who are very feminine and trying to avoid saying or doing anything that's perceived as sort of more masculine, they would probably avoid saying something like "G'day, mate." But that's with native speakers. I think when you're a foreigner and you're learning Australian English, if you're a woman, I would not shy away from saying "G'day, mate" at all, because Australians are going to hear you say that and instantly know that you're trying to sound more Australian and to be friendly. So yeah, it's a very interesting kind of difference between the genders. But every single Australian, no. There are definitely those Australians too who are trying to sort of avoid sounding too Australian. I remember they just didn't want to, growing up, they didn't want to sort of fall into the stereotypes, and especially if they're in jobs that are very formal and everything, they're probably not going to use informal language like that because it'll just get hammered out of them. They'll spend a lot of time in formal situations and they just won't use that kind of language. So yeah, it's an interesting one. But I guess for you guys, it's an exercise is to just listen to what other Australians do and say when you speak to them. What kind of language do they use? And then I would be mirroring that kind of language, right? So if you're out and about and you're getting a coffee and someone says "G'day" to you, you can just say "G'day" back and there's no issue. But obviously if you're at work and it's a formal situation and someone walks up to you and says, "How are you?" you can obviously match that. You can mirror that. You can say, "How are you?" back, You don't have to necessarily use something informal in that situation. So that's a good exercise. When working on your language skills, especially once you're at an intermediate to advanced level, try and pay more attention to what people around you are saying and doing, and then try and incorporate that language into your own vocab and active vocabulary that you're using on a regular basis so that you can sound more Australian, but more like the people around you, if that makes sense. So good question. This one comes from Irvin MTP. Where are you from in Australia? So I was born in a town called Ferntree Gully, which is near Dandenong, to the east of Melbourne. And again, it's close to the high country. It's sort of starting to get towards the Dandenong Ranges, the mountains there. So I was born in Ferntree Gully, the hospital there, but I was raised for the first 9 years of my life in a town called Callista. And this was, up in the mountains. Absolutely beautiful. It has some of the tallest eucalypt trees, I think tallest trees full stop, in the world. They're absolutely massive. It's like a wet rainforest kind of area. And yeah, it was beautiful. So I grew up there for 9 years. My parents then got jobs at Deakin University down here in Geelong. And so we ended up moving down here to live in a town called Ocean Grove. And that's where I spent the rest of my sort of young life growing up, in Ocean Grove and near Geelong. And now I live in a town called Curlewis, which is about 10-15 minutes away from Ocean Grove. Okay, next question. Okay, Kusu says, I'm Japanese. How would you pronounce the beer Asahi? So this is the beer, I think it's it's got like a dark bottle and a grey label, and it's Asahi, and I think that's how you'd say it. I would say Asahi, but I don't know. The emphasis might be in a different position, right? Is it Asahi or Asahi, or Asahi? Like, just flat with no emphasis. I don't know, but I think the average person in Australia would say Asahi. So yeah, you'll have to let me know if I'm saying that right or wrong. This one comes from Ashwin, by the way. Why do Australians call napkins serviettes? This is a good question. So serviette, I imagine this is a French word because it ends with et. And et is usually used in French for something that's small. So you would have like, I guess I don't know, but et at the end. What would be a small version of a serviette? I don't know. There's probably some word that it comes from, but serviette we tend to use in Australia for something that's a piece of paper or paper, kind of like folded up paper that you can have when you're eating, to clean your face or to wipe food off yourself or whatever, it's for cleaning your hands, all that sort of stuff. That's a serviette. For me, a napkin, it can overlap a little bit with serviette. So it could be, like if I went into a cafe and I said, can I have a napkin? They're going to know what I'm talking about, right? They're going to be like, here's a serviette. But typically for me at least, a napkin, I imagine as being something that's more like a cloth, a piece of cloth, a larger kind of thing that you would use at the table to put over your lap or to tuck into your shirt so that you avoid having food, get onto your clothes, right? Like if I went to an Italian restaurant and I had spaghetti bolognese, they would probably give you napkins to use as opposed to serviettes, right? Serviettes kind of seen as a little bit cheap in terms of like if you were to use them at a restaurant on a table. Napkins are those cloth kind of, I don't know how else to explain them. Another word. I guess they're like cloth serviettes that are a little larger, thicker, more durable. They can be washed. And they're like towels, right? Towels that you would use for protecting yourself from eating food. But we would use both. But yes, napkin is probably more napkin is probably more American than it is Australian, but we are so used to American culture that we know exactly what you mean. But serviette would be the typical thing you would use of just going, and getting takeaway food or going to a cafe or something. Okay. So this one comes from Tiger1103. Which is the best supermarket out of Coles, Woolworths, or Aldi? I guess it depends what you mean, right? In terms of best, like in terms of the products they have, in terms of their behaviour as businesses, or the way that their CEOs behave. Because yeah, if it's the latter, Woolworths is probably the worst based on the behaviour of the CEO. Only the last few days, he was threatened with contempt of court or of the I've forgotten the exact wording for the situation he was in, but he was being questioned by a panel from the government effectively in a certain situation. I can't remember the word for it. And he refused to answer the question, a very simple question, repeatedly. I think the person asked it like 12 times or something, and he kept using spin, I think the senator actually got annoyed and said, I don't want to hear your spin or your bullshit, just answer the question. And he just avoided it. So he was threatened with being found, in contempt, meaning he was refusing to answer the question. And it just seems like, he's an absolute scumbag. The CEOs of both Coles and Woolworths seem to be have very bad reputations at the moment, which probably also shows a little bit about what the culture at the companies is like, profits first and everyone else can get stuffed effectively. So probably Aldi out of those three. Coles and Woolworths, I think, have the majority share together of all supermarkets in Australia. All that, the supermarket, having a hard day today with words. Aldi has a smaller share of the market. The market, that's what I wanted to say, the market, right? So Woolworths probably has the most, then Coles, and then I think Aldi has a very small portion. So for now, they have to be, Aldi have to be a little better behaved and, please people to try and grow their market, I guess. All right, this one comes from Floreciendo. Rude phrases to not use in Australia. This is hard because there are a lot that I would never use that I know that are not something I would like to publish on a podcast because, there's always nasty people out there who could just take it out of context and try and get you cancelled. So there are definitely any term that is derogatory so that it's used to harm other people if it is religious, if it is sexually based, or if it is racially based, those tend to be the ones that you would just avoid, because they're only there to hurt other people, right? Like, the classic one is the N word, which I'm not even comfortable saying. In America, the N word is what they would use. Oh, black people use it all the time informally between themselves, but then there's the racist type of saying that word that you would only ever use to kind of vilify someone racially. And so that's the kind of phrase that you would never use as an Australian, at least, probably as a white American as well, unless you are trying to hurt other people. Besides that, rude phrases, it's really going to depend on the situation, because, if you're in a formal situation, you're going to avoid rude words like, shit, fuck, piss, cock, cunt, all those sorts of words, that in other situations you won't avoid, because it's really context dependent. Like, if I'm talking to my best mate who's a man, and an Australian, I'll be using words like piss, fuck, shit, way more frequently than when I'm talking to my wife. And then beyond that, when I'm talking to my grandparents, I will pretty much never swear in front of them, right? And it's a sign of respect, and also that they're just very conservative and they don't swear, right? So that's another situation where I would just... It's so context dependent. So I could go, you could watch me speaking English during the day, and I'm going to swear with certain people in certain situations, but then in other situations I'm not going to at all. So yeah, it is. It's just so context dependent. But I'm trying to think of anything else. There's some interesting words. This is sort of related to it, I guess. But it's funny, there are American phrases. I was talking about this with my dad on a podcast recently. I'm not sure if it's been published yet or not, but it was a Goss episode about swearing in Australian English. And we mentioned these different, the taboo words and also ones like this that are American. So rude phrases like cocksucker and motherfucker, those are ones that we know and hear quite a lot because of American TV. But it just doesn't sound right when Australians say it. It's one of those things where it's funny. These are rude phrases that we know and hear quite a lot because of Americans, but they just don't get used a lot in Australian English. Probably because we find that they don't hit hard enough. If you're going to call someone a cocksucker, you probably just call them a cunt. If you really want to get to a point of offending them, right? Whereas in America, the C word, cunt, is way, way, way heavier. I think they would typically use other words like cocksucker. So I don't know. I find that stuff really interesting, though, how the swearing differs between cultures and nationalities. All right, another one. This one comes from Taehoon Kim, 119. If you could travel back in time, when would you go to and why? And this was a really good question. There's a lot. At the moment, I'm really sucked into a TV series called Time Team, which is a TV series from Great Britain, and it follows a group of archaeologists, and I think it's got like 22 seasons or something, It went for 2 decades. And they go around the country effectively looking at different sites, and usually they spend 3 days digging at the site and trying to find out all sorts of information about all these different periods. So from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age, to the Iron Age, to Rome, and then the Dark Ages, the Medieval Ages, and then more recently. And so I find that stuff endlessly fascinating. But I think for me, the most interesting part of history that I would love to travel back to would probably be ancient Rome. I feel like it would just have been such an interesting place if you could go back and, just watch what was going on. Obviously, living there would probably have been a different situation. They had slaves. Women were treated as second-class citizens, obviously, in this period of time. The average person was probably dirt poor. You didn't have Game Boys, you didn't have PlayStations, you didn't have guitars, so you didn't have iPhones. It would have been a very tough life. But it would have been so interesting to just see what the Roman Empire was like, because it was spread across such a large area from Great Britain all the way into places like Syria and down into Africa and, into Egypt and stuff. I feel like it would be just so cool to go back and do a tour of the entire empire, right? And be able to just see all of these different cultures intermingling. I would love to have seen how Latin was spoken, hear it actually being spoken. And I imagine there would have been different dialects of Latin across the entire empire with different accents and everything like that. So being able to go back and see how all these cultures were intermixing, different races were, people of different hierarchy, in the hierarchy of different levels, I feel like it just would have been so, so, so cool to go back and see that. But really, any period in history there's something interesting about it. Even if you only go back a couple of 100 years or even 100 years, things are very different. Another period of time might be like the period of colonization in Australia, especially when Arthur Phillip arrived in Sydney, and to have just seen what the original colony was like, and the interactions with the Indigenous people. I would love to have seen what Australia looked like prior to colonization, or even during that period, being able to see what Indigenous people were doing. How did they live? Hear their languages, learn from them, even learn their languages. Like, it must have just been so interesting to have come to such a huge continent, a huge country that Westerners had never really, they'd never colonized it. They'd been here before. They had sort of, touched base and seen the shore, but they had never tried to set up a colony and live there. And I feel like that would have been really hard. And there would have been a lot of, huge issues with it, but it would have been interesting nonetheless, I think. Especially, people like Buckley, he was a convict who ran away from the colonial powers, obviously, in Victoria in I think it was about 1802 or something, around here, in fact, where I live. And he ended up living with the Indigenous people here for 35 years, learning the language. I think he married. I'm not sure if he had kids or not, but yeah, he lived with them. He embedded himself with them for 35 years. And I just can't imagine what it would have been like being him, seeing what he saw, understanding the culture, the Indigenous culture here of the Wathaurong people, being embedded in it, being almost accepted as, a local Indigenous person, but also understanding what British life was like. He was born in England, right? Like, so that period too would have been just endlessly interesting, I feel. If you could go back and just watch, or ask people questions, I think those are kind of two periods that I definitely think about, damn, it's so interesting. And the explorers in Australia as well, going around. Again, this isn't to minimize some of the atrocities that happened and the way Indigenous people were treated or anything like that, but I feel like it would have just been so interesting seeing Australia before the effects of being colonized really spread across the country, right? All the wildlife that was here, and all the Indigenous people living across the country in different ways, with their different cultures, how they interacted, there's just so many interesting things. And you could probably do the same thing with going back and seeing Indigenous people living in their environments anywhere in the world, and it would be interesting, right? So that's what I can think of off the top of my head. All right, this one's an easy one. This one comes from KD Sumanta. How do you pronounce lemonade? So lemon, right? The schwa is the second syllable. Lemon. So the first syllable is stressed. Le-mun. And then we have aid. Lemonade. 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 That's how I would say it. Okay, let's try and do a few more. Okay, Ag586. Can you sponsor me for cricket in Australia? I'm from India. Please sponsor me for cricket. Unfortunately, mate, I don't think I have the ability to do that. I think you'd have to ask someone who works in the cricket industry. I'm not sure if there's even a program for that, but good luck. I hope you find someone to sponsor you. I should have read the question before I answered it, but interesting one. Okay. This one comes from Kun1009. Do you use American or Australian accents to sing a song if it is from an American singer? This is such a good question. I think we would switch. When singing, there's a kind of general accent that happens, right? Vowels change. It's one of these interesting things that happens. But yeah, I remember when I was in a band, I used to be a singer, and when I was in a band, I used to sound like, there was this American singer that I used to get accused of sounding like, and it was because I would pronounce certain words with an American accent. So I'll have to, who was it? I'm trying to think of it was Placebo. It was the band Placebo, the every me and every you, that band. So yeah, I'll have to think a bit more about it, but I think you would. It'd be weird to sing a song that was sung by an American and change the accent to Australian and leave everything else the same. It's kind of like when you hear hip hop, and if they use an Australian accent, like I find it difficult to listen to Australian rappers just because it just sounds so weird listening to like Australian accents coming out, because they almost add to it and make it sound a bit more Aussie than it really is. They make it a bit more ochre or a bit more bogan. It's a bit stronger, and it's a bit too full on. So yeah, I don't know. It's a weird one, but it'd be interesting to ask you guys about that in your languages. What happens when people sing in your different languages? Are there certain accents that are used? Like in Spanish, Latin music. Do they typically use, say, a Colombian accent or a Mexican accent, or is there all sorts of different accents, or is there one kind of general Spanish kind of accent that's used? All right. Let's keep going. I'll do one more. Where is the best place to raise kids in Australia? This one comes from Lorene Schved. In a loving family, mate. I know that's not what you're asking, but I think there are plenty of good places. Probably, suburbia, pretty much anywhere is fine, right? If you can get out of the city where the kids have got somewhere that they're safe, that they're able to get outside, they're able to run around in the, with supervision or not, depending on their age, and it's safe for them to do so, and there's nature nearby, and they've got, a loving family, maybe even relatives nearby. I think, that's the best you can ask for. So, but there's not just like a single place in Australia that's good for it. You're going to find these places all over the country, everywhere, and I think really if you can think about your kids and their safety and also their relationships with people around them, whether that's family, whether they have friends, if they have a loving environment where they're safe and secure and they have connections with a lot of other people, there's not much more you can ask for, right? You've nailed it if you can get into a situation where that's the case. So yeah, but I think, find somewhere that you can afford, that's safe, where you can get a job and where you can develop connections with the community, and you're sweet. So yeah, anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this episode, guys. Just a little reminder, there's no transcript for these episodes, but there are for every other podcast episode on the podcast. And thanks again for your questions. If you guys want to ask me questions, I try and do a Q&A on Mondays. So I put up on my Instagram, I put up a Ask Me Anything little box in the stories, and you guys can ask me these questions and then I can answer them on Instagram, but I also will try and do it in an Ask Me Anything episode as well. So I'm your host, Pete. This is Aussie English. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Tooroo!